Welcome to the Book of Joshua with Katsuo Jacobs, Devin Reisenhoover, and David Nichols. Take out your notes and let's get started. Before the book of Joshua starts, Moses messes up by not going into the land of Canaan, when 10 spies they sent became intimidated by the people that inhabited Canaan and didn't want to go into the land. Joshua's son Nun and Caleb were the only two original spies who went into the land and had faith in God's ability to get the people into their hand. Because the Israelites didn't have faith in God, God forced them to wander into the wilderness for 40 years, because God wanted the generation of people who didn't have faith in God to die off before entering the land that He gave them. Chapter 1, the Lord appoints a leader. Joshua is made leader of the people of Israel, appointed by God. God establishes Joshua as the new Moses in verse 5 and creates a covenant, which is a binding agreement or legal contract made between God and Joshua. In this covenant, God tells Joshua that he will never leave him or forsake him. Joshua commanded. The Lord commanded Joshua 3 times to be strong and courageous. The first time he commanded him to be strong and courageous, since he would lead the people into the promised land. He tells him this because of the previous fall of the Israelites 40 years ago, where they were scared of the land and didn't have trust in the Lord's protection for them. Second time he reminds Joshua to be strong and courageous, but this time in accordance to obeying the law of Moses. The third and final time in chapter 1 that he tells Moses to be strong and courageous is when he reminds him by saying, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous." He is telling him this final time to remind him not to be scared when fighting the Canaanites. He ends his command by telling him that God will be with him wherever he goes. The people will treat Joshua as they did with Moses. This ties back to God saying Joshua is equal to Moses. Israel clears out. After this, Joshua commands the people to pack up their provisions so they can leave. Joshua also tells the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half tribe of Manasseh to stay in the land that Moses previously allotted to them in Numbers 32, verse 33 through 38, but send their men of valor or men that showed courage and fearlessness in battle. These men of valor were not to return until the promised land had been conquered.
Devin! Shh! I'm spying out the land of Jericho right now. See, Joshua authorized spies to go into Jericho. He actually sent 2 of them. Upon arriving in Jericho, the spies came upon a prostitute's house whose name is Rahab. The king of Jericho would be told that the men of Israel were in Rahab's house, to which the king would send men from Jericho to seek out the Israelite spies. And when the king's men had arrived at Rahab's house, she would lie to them by telling them they had indeed been in her house, but they had left to go to the Jordan River. Rahab's assistance to the spies was of tremendous importance. She hid the spies on her roof, and when the king's guards came to her house, she sent the guards in a different direction. Rahab declared her faith by saying, "The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below." As a result of Rahab's faith and actions, the 2 men promised to protect Rahab and her family when the Israelites returned. They told her, if you don't tell what we are doing, we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us land." Rahab ties a scarlet cord to a window. After the encounter with the king's men, Rahab would let the men go down the wall from the window inside her house using a scarlet cord. As the men were going down the wall, she told them to go into the hills for 3 days because the king's men would return and search for them. Before the men set off to the hills, they told Rahab to hang the scarlet cord out the window when they returned to protect her house. After this, they would set off and go into the hills. The spies would spend 3 days in the mountains. After 3 days in the hills, the spies would pass over Jericho and go back to Joshua and report their findings in Jericho to Joshua.
Joshua chapter 3, Israel crosses the Jordan. Joshua 3 starts out with the Israelites grabbing their belongings and going towards the Jordan River. They were ordered in verses 3 and 4, when you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the Levitical priests carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. Then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. But keep a distance of about 2,000 cubits between you and the ark. Do not go near it. This seems extreme that even the chosen people of God are to keep themselves at least 2,000 cubits away from the ark at all times. And 2,000 cubits would be about 3,000 feet today, which is far away to be following someone. This shows how God's people had to fear the Lord and did not take him lightly. The Israelites are next ordered to consecrate themselves, for tomorrow God would do something miraculous. Consecrate means to make or declare something sacred. This is important because the idea that they wanted to make their bodies sacred just to witness the miracle of God, once again showing how they feared God, but not out of fearfulness, but out of reverence for who he was. Then the Lord provides safe passage. God speaks to Joshua and says he will make it known that he is with Joshua as with Moses. We see this representation for Joshua as the second Moses, and Joshua is meant to be a foreshadowing of Jesus to come.
Then Joshua tells the people what will happen, that when the priests carrying the ark touch the Jordan, it will split and be crossable. Then, when they went out and the feet of the priests carrying the ark touched the river, it was split just like God said it would be, and the Israelites crossed safely. Now, when I hear this story, I think of the waters being right next to them like a wall of water going straight up. But that's not what the Bible says. It says that the waters were piled up to a town called Adam, and when looking at a map, that town is about 1.5 miles away from the Jordan River. Not only this, but it says the Israelite crossed on dry ground, which makes no sense since the ground of the Jordan would be mushy and super wet since it had a river on top of it. But somehow, God even draws the water out of the ground and makes it dry. Chapter 4, Israel enters Canaan. Joshua 4 picks up directly at the end of chapter 3 when all the people have finished crossing through the Jordan River. Joshua commands 12 guys, one from each tribe, to take up a stone and place it at the spot where the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant stood. Joshua told the people that these were to serve as a memorial that the Israelites would tell their kids when they saw the stones what God had done for them this day. Once again showing a reverent fear of the Lord. A woman named Sherry Abbott went into a deeper meaning of what the stones symbolized, saying, I propose that the 12 stones under the waters of the Jordan are a typological picture of all people who reject the salvation that God offers. They have not been delivered. They have not crossed over and received the grace of God. They remain under the waters and are not counted among those who have entered into their inheritance, the promised land. She also points out how water is a representation of God's wrath, shown through the flood, the Red Sea drying Egyptians, and Jonah going underwater, etc. Another person named A.W. Pink wrote that the Jordan River, when translated from its two Hebrew root words, means spread, judging. Joshua commissions Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh. Then the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh went in front of the Israelites, ready for war. This is done because Moses told them when they were children that they would do so, once again serving as a reminder of obedience throughout Joshua that even as kids, they had a fear of the Lord.
Chapter 5, the Lord administers advice. After the Israelites cross the Jordan, word reaches the Amorite kings of not only the might of the Israelites, but also the might of their God, who stopped the entire Jordan River. The Bible then says the Amorites' hearts melted in fear. Joshua was commanded by God to circumcise the sons of Israel at Gibeath Haaralah, since the Israelites had not circumcised any of the men born to them on the way to Egypt. The Israelites eat the food of Canaan. After the circumcisions were finished, the men would stay in the camp they set up and would wait until they were healed. While the people were camped at Gilgal, their Passover was kept to the 14th day of the month in the plains of Jericho. After the Passover, the people of Israel would start eating the foods of Canaan and not of the food that God gave them called manna. These actions would cause the manna to no longer exist to the people of Israel. The angel of the Lord visits Joshua. When Joshua was passing by Jericho, he saw a man standing before him with a sword lifted to the sky. Joshua goes to the man and asks him a question. Are you for us or for you for adversaries? And he said, No, I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come. Joshua, after hearing this, will fall on his face and worship him. What does my Lord say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. To which the Joshua would follow.
Chapter 6. Angel of the Lord commands Joshua. Because of the Israelites, Jericho would be defeated, and in fear of the Israelites, the city of Jericho closed its gates, and no one came into Jericho, no one came out. The Lord would tell Joshua that he had handed Jericho over to him. Then the Lord would command him to march around the city walls for 6 days, and 7 priests would bear 7 trumpets. And on the 7th day they would march around the city walls 7 times, and the priests shall blow their trumpets. Israel marches around Jericho. On the first day of the march, Joshua told the people not to shout until he commanded them to. Do not make your voices known. And after the first day of marching around the city walls, the people of Israel would return to camp and rest for the night. On the second day, Joshua rose up early, and they set off to Jericho again, blowing the ram horn and marching around the city wall once. After they had completed their march, they returned to camp once again and rested. God hands Jericho to Israel. On the 7th day, Joshua rose up early again like every other day. But today the people would march around the city walls 7 times. And once the priests had blown their trumpets, Joshua commanded the people to shout. So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown. After this, the wall would fall, and everything was destroyed at the edge of a sword. Joshua told the spies who had entered Jericho earlier to go seek out the prostitute and everyone that had been with her and belonged to her, and take them out of the city and into the camp. Once they were out of the city, the Israelites would burn down the city with fire and destroy everything except only silver and gold and the vessels of bronze and iron. They put into the treasure of the house of the Lord. Covenants kept with Rahab. Joshua 6 ends off with telling us that Rahab the prostitute and her father's household and all who belonged to her were saved by Joshua, and she lives in Israel to this day because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent out to spy Jericho. Joshua laid an oath on them at the time, saying, "The Lord will curse any man who rebuilds Jericho." Later in the Bible, we see God honor this curse that Joshua spoke over Jericho in 1 Kings 16:34, where a man attempts to rebuild Jericho, and in the process he loses 3 of his sons as punishment from God. Joshua 6 shows the character of God and of the Israelites. First, God displays faithfulness and remembers the covenant he made with Rahab and her household. The second is Israel's their covenant with Rahab by accepting her into the Israel community and not killing her.
Chapter 7, Achan's atrocity. The Israelites were unfaithful about the devoted things. Joshua would send men from Jericho to Ai, which was near Beth, to spout the region. The men would listen to Joshua and spout the land of Ai. When the men returned to Joshua, they told him that not all the army will have to go up against Ai. This was because of how small Ai was compared to the size of the Israelites. Israel attacks Ai. So Joshua would send about 2,000 to 3,000 men to Ai. So 3,000 men went up from the people, and they fled before the men of Ai. And the men of Ai killed about 36 of their men and chased them before the gate as far as Shebarim and struck them at the descent. And the hearts of the people melted and became like water. After this, Joshua tore his clothes and fell before the ark of the covenant and put dirt on his head, showing his grief for the Israeli life lost. Achan punished. Joshua then cries out to the Lord and asks him why God would send him across the Jordan just to bring him into the hand of the people of the land of Canaan. Once Joshua had cried out to the Lord revealed to him that Achan, son of Carmi, had taken 200 shekels, 1 gold bar, and a cloak from the ruins of Jericho, which God told them not to take for themselves, but to dedicate to the Lord. After this, Joshua told the tribes of Israel to assemble, or he told them that someone's sin caused them to lose against Ai. In response to this, Israel found the person who sinned, whose name was Achan, and took him and his entire family into a valley with all his possessions to stone them, which was just in the eyes of the Lord. Chapter 8, Israel's triumph over Ai. After Achan is stoned, the Lord tells Joshua that he has given Ai into his hand since Joshua corrected Achan's sin. Joshua was told by the Lord to take up all the men and do to Ai what they did to Jericho. The Lord also tells Joshua that the people of Israel can take its livestock and its spoils can be taken for themselves instead of being devoted to God like they did with the plunder of Jericho. Israel then destroys Ai. Joshua takes 30,000 mighty men of valor, which were men who showed extreme courage and effectiveness on the battlefield like modern-day U.S. Marines. Joshua took his soldiers out by cover of night and positioned 5,000 of them in cover in front of the city of Ai to wait for an ambush. Then Joshua took a bigger group of soldiers of about 25,000 and went in front of the main city gate to wait for the army of Ai to pursue the Israelites to kill them. Just like the last time Israel tried to defeat Ai, the soldiers of Ai saw the Israelites and came out to pursue them. Only this time, when the army of Ai pursued the Israelites, 5,000 men that were hiding came out of their hiding place, captured the city, and set it on fire. Once the city of Ai was set ablaze, once the army of Ai saw their city burning, they fled in fear of the Israelites. After the army of Ai started to flee, the Israelites pursued them, killed all of them, and captured their king. All the people of Ai that were killed were 12,000. Joshua commanded that all the inhabitants of Ai to be killed to devote them to destruction. Joshua also devoted the city of Ai to destruction by burning it. After this, they hung the king of Ai and placed his body on a pile of rubble at the gate of the city of Ai. Joshua then built an altar. Once all the cattle and valuables were taken from the city of Ai, Joshua erected an altar of uncut stones to which he gave an offering to the Lord on top of Mount Ebal. Throughout Joshua 8, it reminds us of how good of a leader Joshua is by telling us that he was with the Israelites that had to run from the army of Ai. This shows Joshua's courage and how he cares for the people of Israel.
Chapter 9, Joshua's tricked. Some men from the countries of Gibeon, Jepariah, Beriath, and Kiriath Jearimah. These 4 men came from these countries to gain protection from Israel. They had heard of what happened to the other countries who had fallen to the Israelites. They deceived them by saying that they were from far away, while in truth they were from countries nearby, and feared Israel would conquer them too. Joshua was supposed to consult the Lord before deciding, but he had made the covenant without doing so, so he was tricked. Then the Israelites went out to conquer more land, but when they reached their land and were about to attack them, they could not, because the leaders of the congregation had sworn to them by the Lord. So they took the men who had made a covenant with them and let them live, deciding to make them servants of Israel for the rest of their lives. This chapter displays the cost of Joshua trying to do life without God. Because of not asking God for advice, Israel made a covenant with people from Canaan. This was wrong for the Israelites because God tells them to kill all the inhabitants of Canaan, as discussed in Deuteronomy 20, where God gives them instructions on what to do when going to war, so that they might not stray from God to the gods of the other nation.
Chapter 10. Nations align against Israel and Gibeon. Word reached the other nations in the land of Canaan about Israel conquering Jericho and Ai, who were mighty nations. Word also reaches the other nations of Israel's alliance with Gibeon, who was an immensely powerful nation. This scared remaining nations in the land of Canaan because they knew the Israelites would be coming for them next. The conquering of Jericho and Ai not only meant that Israel was stronger than those nations, but it also meant the God of Israel was stronger than the gods of Jericho and Ai. In fear of Israel, the king of Jerusalem, king of Hebron, king of Jarmuth, king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon gathered their armies and the armies of 5 other unnamed Amorite kingdoms, and went against the army of Gibeon, who was a mighty nation, with many mighty men. Once the forces of the kings amassed against the Gibeonites, they sent word and asked for Joshua to be faithful to his word with them and come to their aid and defend them. Joshua responded by marching all the mighty men of valor of Israel, from Gilgal to the Gibeonites. While marching, the Lord commanded Joshua to strike, for he gave them to his hand. The Israelite army moves. The Israelite army marched through the night and met the opposing armies of many kings, to which the Lord threw them into confusion, and the Israelites struck a great blow on them. In their confusion, the opposing armies fled from the Israelites. The Israelites chastened, the Lord threw large hailstones down upon the fleeing enemies, to which the Lord killed many enemies with the hailstones than the Israelites did with the sword. Sun and moon stand still. After this, Joshua spoke to the Lord and asked him if he could make the sun and moon stand still, and God listened to Joshua's request. Right here is a notable example of one of the major theological truths displayed in the book of Joshua. This truth is that the Lord will be faithful to Joshua and he will never forsake him. In return, the Lord asked that Joshua would follow him and lead Israel to obey him. So the sun and the moon stayed still in place, and the army of Israel took vengeance on the kings and the armies of Canaan. Then the 5 Amorite kings hid themselves in caves and were found, and Joshua commanded people to place their feet on their necks and kill them. Once they were dead, they hung them and put their dead bodies in the caves where they hid. After this, Joshua took the rest of the Israelites' army to conquer the land of Canaan.
Chapter 11 and 12. Kings align against Israel again. Once again, many kings of the land of Canaan banded against the Israelites. 17 regions in which multiple kings reigned combined forces and went against the Israelites. The Bible says that they were a great horde, and that the alliance they went against was called the Alliance of Hazor. This would have been an exceptionally large army compared to the size of Israel's army. However, even though the opposing army was very great, God would not forget his covenant with Abraham, and he would not forget his promise to Joshua. Israel was victorious against the Alliance of Hazor. God instructs Joshua that he should not fear the opposing army, that instead he should trust in the Lord and remember the promise where God told him he would never leave him nor forsake him. And he reminds him again to be strong and courageous. The army of Israel proceeds to kill the Alliance of Hazor. After this, Joshua tells us about the kings he killed and how he killed them. A total of 31 kings would be defeated by Joshua alone. Joshua chapters 13 through 17. Allotment of land for 3 tribes and others. God tells Joshua what land needs to be taken, and after the land is taken, Joshua is to divide up the land with the rest of the Israelites. Chapter 13 and 14 are both about dividing the land east of the Jordan and west. The end of chapter 14 talks about Joshua blessing Caleb, one of the spies who went into Jericho, with an inheritance which was a man of the name Hebron, who was the greatest man among the Anakites. The allotment for the tribe of Judah, according to its claims, extended down to the territory of Edom to the desert of Zin in the extreme south. The allotment for Joseph began at the Jordan, east of the springs of Jericho, and went up from there through the desert into the hill country of Bethel. It went on from Bethel, that is Luz, crossed over to the territory of the Arkites and Adaroth, descended westward to the territory of the Japhetites, as far as the region of Lower Beth Horon and on to Gezer, ending at the Mediterranean Sea. In the first few verses, we see the distribution of the land among the remaining families of the tribe of Manasseh and the inheritance of Zelophehad's daughters. The Bible states specifically that Zelophehad's only had daughters and no sons, and this is important, as usually women did not receive an inheritance. Joshua chapter 18. Joshua sends surveyors of the land. 7 Israelite tribes still had not received their inheritance in the promised land, and Joshua suggested it was because they were slow to obey God's command and conquer the remaining territory. He told them to send 3 men from each tribe to inspect the remaining land and write up a description. Allotment of land for Benjamin. After this, Joshua cast lots for the allotment of land for the tribe of Benjamin. Casting lots was a thing they did in ancient times, where they would throw dice and determine an answer based on how the dice landed. Joshua 19, the allotment of land for remaining tribes. This chapter records the farther allotment of land for the tribes of Israel, especially the tribes of Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and Dan, as well as Joshua's inheritance, a part of a section compromising Joshua 13, 1 through 21, 45, about the Israelites allotting the land of Canaan.
Chapter 20. Israel designates cities of refuge. Part of the inheritance consisted of 48 cities spread throughout the land, Numbers 35, 6 through 7. Of these 48 cities, 6 were designed as cities of refuge. These cities were Kadesh, Shechem, Hebron, Bazar, Ramoth, and Golan, Joshua 27 through 8. What this means is that anyone who murders shall flee to one of these cities, stand at the city's entrance, and explain their case to the city's elders, Joshua 20:40. And if the avenger of blood pursues him, they shall not give up the manslayer into his hands, because he struck his neighbor unknowingly, and did not hate him in the past. And he shall remain in the city until he has stood before the congregation of judgment, until the death of him who is high priest at the time. Then the manslayer may return to his own town and his own home, to the town from which he fled. Joshua 25 through 6. These were the cities designed for all the people who Israel and for the strangers sojourning among them, that anyone who killed a person without intent could flee there, so that he might not die by the hand of the avenger of blood, till he stood before the congregation. Joshua 29. Chapter 21. Joshua gives cities to the Levites. The Lord never intended the Levites to have inherited land in Canaan, because their inheritance was the Lord. Instead, the Lord gave them 48 cities of refuge for their family and their livestock to stay in, while the men who would be Levitical priests.
Joshua chapter 22. Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh return home. Joshua chapter 22 starts out with God telling the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh to go home to their land, for they have obeyed the Lord in all he has asked of them. They had claimed these lands because these tribes had much livestock, and the land east of the Jordan was seen as a prime place for raising livestock, as it says in Numbers 32:1. This shows their commitment to the Lord, as when they had already reached their land, they still went ahead of the rest of the Israelites to bring them to their own land, when they could have just settled down and been done. The 3 tribes then built an altar, and when the rest of Israel heard this, they were fierce and prepared to go to war against them, for they thought the altar was to another god or gods. Before doing so, they sent an assembly asking why they had betrayed the Lord. The 3 tribes answered, saying that they built the altar to the Lord so that the descendants of the other tribes would not say that they had nothing to do with the Lord, since the Jordan divided them.
Chapter 23. Joshua gives advice to leaders. The Bible says that the Lord has given Israel a rest from all their surrounding enemies, and Joshua was also old during this time. In verse 2, Joshua summons all of Israel and tells them that God had fought for them, and not for his sake, but for their sake. He also tells them that God has given them inheritance of the land of Canaan, thus being tribes. God will push them and drive them out of the land before you get there, he says, and you shall possess their land just as the Lord your God promised you. The people of Israel are told to be strong and to do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses. They are not to mix with the other nations nor mention the names of their gods. The rest of the chapter speaks upon keeping their faith with the Lord, their God, for he has driven out the people of the land which they stand on. And if they transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and you go and serve the other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from off the good land that he has given to you.
Chapter 24. Joshua commands leaders to follow God. Chapter 24 starts with Joshua giving a speech to the elders of Israel about their journey up until here. Then Joshua questions the people of Israel and asks them if they will continue to serve God, and they respond by saying yes, we will. Joshua also places the stone as a witness against the Israelites and their claim to promise to serve the Lord. After this, Joshua dies and is buried in the land of Canaan. The book also tells us the people of Israel remembered Joseph and buried him in the land of Canaan.
Transformational truths. Throughout the book of Joshua, the author of the book, who scholars think was Joshua, shows us two transformational truths, as well as a scarlet cord, which is how Jesus is shown in every book of the Bible. First, let's talk about the first transformational truth we saw in Joshua. In the book of Joshua, we see the Lord being faithful in the covenant with Abraham and Joshua. First, we see the Lord partially fulfill his covenant with Abraham by giving the people of Israel the promised land. At the end of Joshua, we see that Joshua tells the people of Israel that there is still more land to be conquered and that the Lord has given it to them. The next covenant the Lord keeps is with Joshua. The Lord keeps his covenant by never leaving Joshua or forsaking him. The Lord made his covenant with Joshua all the way back in chapter 1, and it is cool to see how the Lord remembers his promise throughout the chapter, even in times when the Israelites should have lost the battles because of being outnumbered. The Lord still remembered them and gave them the victory.
This ties into our second truth, and that is that Joshua was obedient and feared the Lord throughout the book. The Lord asked Joshua for his obedience and fear at the beginning in chapter 1, after he promises to never leave him nor forsake him, and throughout the book we see Joshua do so, with Joshua himself only straying away from God once when he made an alliance with the kingdoms of Gibeon, Sepharvath, Beeroth, and Kiriath Jearim. The only other time Joshua quote-unquote messes up is when Achan isn't obedient to the Lord, which isn't directly Joshua's fault since he did not commit the crime, but since he was the leader of Israel, he's responsible for it. You can see throughout the book how not only Joshua was obedient, but the whole of Israel. There are many examples when the Israelites showed a fear and obedience to the Lord, such as the Israelites crossing the Jordan, the triumph over Ai, Jericho, and many others. Joshua serves as a reminder that we are to have a reverent fear and obedience to the Lord.
Now that we talked about the truths in this book, let's talk about the scarlet cord of Jesus in this book. The first evidence of the scarlet cord is the Lord using Joshua to pave the way for Israel to inherit the promised land. But there is a more literal scarlet cord in Joshua, with Rahab. Rahab hangs a literal scarlet cord out of her window to spare her life from the Israelites after they conquered Jericho. We see Rahab have faith in the Lord without even being an Israelite. This shows her fear of the Lord. Rahab was also in the genealogy of Jesus, showing how God uses a prostitute to be in the genealogy of Jesus, who was a perfect human being. This shows the depth of God's mercy on us, going as far as to use a prostitute to be a great-grandmother of Jesus. Rahab literally shows the scarlet cord, with Rahab hanging the cord out of her window.
All in all, Joshua is a book of obedience and faithfulness, demonstrating how God always rewards our obedience. It may not be the way we want or expect it to, but God is always faithful to us, showing how even when Israel messed up, God disciplined his people and then forgives them, reeling them back into his love whenever we stray. Thanks for watching our teaching of Joshua, and bye!
Bye! Say bye!